Hey, good morning, all. Good to have you this morning. As always, as we gather together on a Sunday morning as community, even though we're all, stuck at home, including me here in my little domicile with Lori, uh, just some opening remarks as we kind of orient this morning. I was sort of it's somewhat humorous that the only thing that's important in a Zoom call are all these new ways in which we connect together digitally is the shirt, right? You have to at least put on a shirt. And today, I've chosen my vintage shirt that I got up in Portland to sort of connect with the theme for the day. How do you put on something ancient and journey into the future? That's what I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on today as we think about ways in which we can both reach back to the almost like the origins of what humanity embraced as their religious experience as humanity evolved, right? To kind of reach way, way back and hold on to some of the wisdom from our ancestors of old, and also embrace our more modern ways of thinking about the role of religion in our lives to help shape a future. And this sort of capacity to reach back, we've talked about many times, and this kind of hope of crafting a new future. Obviously, we wrap our hearts and souls around in a moment like this. How to do those at the same time when we don't get to kind of collectively gather together in community on a Sunday morning. How can you maybe explore that as you continue in this mode of isolation? So that's sort of my theme for today. Um, Glad to see you all logging on and know that we're in a new platform this morning. So we're on the new OSLC Facebook page. And if you're taking some time to figure out, well, where are they exactly? Please join us over here. And when you do, like this page so that it's easy for you to access, both to look at these or view these if you miss them on a Sunday morning, but also to participate each Sunday. So glad you're starting to climb on board here. I wanted to start a little bit with kind of this feeling I have that, as the kind of call for physical isolation continues, as we continue as a nation and a world, but particularly the United States, to struggle with this pandemic, we're all sort of on our own. And it's for those of us who are introverts, it's not that bad, but it is dragging on and on. And so it kind of feels like we're all in our own little lifeboats, floating on this big deep sea of so many issues, and kind of calling out to each other to make sure that we're not alone in this thing, that we can hear one another despite the distance, that we can gain some wisdom and insight from one another so that we can manage the day to day. And particularly my role in this community is just to provide, just some insights into how to hold on to your religious experience or your religious sensitivity or your own religious journey in a way that can work, even though you're distanced from the common life that we share. And I was struck this last week. I was talking to a friend. We had a little social distancing coffee hour together. She was advising us on the use of our facility. And as I was talking to her, she started sharing that for her, she's very busy at work, almost like overwhelmed with the amount of work that she has to do and the complications of doing that work from a distance. But at the same time, she misses this capacity to nurture in herself some deep and kind of religious experience. And so she said at home, she's built a kind of a shrine or an altar, just this corner of her house, that she accumulates all of the kind of the symbols or the reminders to her of what is sacred in the world, what is holy for her. I mean, it can be very personal. It can be reaching back into her own lineage. It can have a connection to the environment, whatever that happens to be. She's created this small shrine in the corner of her home. And as she told me about that, she goes, I don't like kneel before the shrine and, kind of worship the shrine. It exists as a tethering place and moment that keeps her connected or mindful of her own soul's journey, even in the midst of all this frenetic energy that she has to engage in her workplace and her work environment and navigating, the social milieu in which we all find ourselves these days. And as she told me that story, I thought, if you stay for the whole 45 minutes, that's awesome. But my kind of encouraging word to you today is that kind of stuff matters. And especially as educators are starting to engage back in school, the academic year is ramping up, how quickly we're going to be overwhelmed with navigating the logistics of all that. Could it be that you put some religious rigor into your routines, your daily routines, your weekly routines in a simple way that's sort of in your lifeboat, right? That works for you and your household? Whether it be like the small shrine or some other way to construct a ritual or to memorialize something that is able to invite you into that experience, whether you're present for it or if it's just in your sight line as you leave the house or wake up in the morning. Find a way to do that. I think it's critical for our times, particularly given the situation that we're in. So that's what I want to explore today a little bit, and feeling like, hey, it's it's partly my job just to remind myself and all of us that matters, right? That's been a part of what it means to be human for so long that we don't want to lose connection to that as we move through these complicated times. This week in particular, I was struck with the dynamic of how that works. In light of the celebration of the 75th anniversary, I don't think we'll call it a celebration, more of a reflection of the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I was watching some of the rituals that they were engaged in, the way in which they memorialized that moment as a public event in order for them, one, not to forget, to stay connected to an experience that was so traumatic and shook the foundations, literally, of their physical home, and so many lives were lost. I mean, the idea of the United States dropping one bomb on Hiroshima and 140,000 people, lose their lives. It's devastating. So there's these moments when a country like Japan comes together, memorializes that experience, that moment in time, so that it can reside in sort of the collective whole, so that as a collective, they don't forget. As a collective, we don't forget the significance of that moment. And then those sorts of moments of memorialization, of ritualizing, allow you to let something in the past sink down into the depths of your soul long enough and to be weighty enough to help you figure out how to go forward, right? That we need to work hard at removing that kind of weaponry from the human experience moving forward. It's so clear. Have we not learned our lesson, right? How do we move beyond that? So religions sort of are those ways in which, and to me, that's kind of a religious moment, right? Anytime you collectively ritualize or memorialize something, it has power to affect the whole. And we've been using that tool as human beings throughout our evolutionary process, right? From the most ancient experience of what it meant to be human to today, we continue to do that. So today, to get started, I lit a candle inside of a paper lantern, which is one of the rituals that they did to memorialize the bombing of Hiroshima. They lit those lanterns and floated them in the water at the epicenter of the bombing. And my sense is that each lantern, for the people who gathered there that day, held a spirit or a soul whose life was lost and now drifts downstream into the great unknown. And to watch the people at the side of the river as the lanterns were floated in the waters was just a kind of a deeply moving experience. And so today, to tap into the power of what it means to ritualize or memorialize, let's just pause for a moment together today. And with my candle or your candle, imagine it being a part of that country's experience of pausing, of sitting for a moment with the weight of that experience, ritualizing it so that it's not forgotten, that it becomes part of the collective whole, the wisdom of the collective whole to move forward. And so let's just pause in silence today and maybe even imagine the toning of the bell that took place but a few days ago to kind of hold the collective experience around the bombing of Hiroshima and to feel the weight of that with that country today. So I just invite you into a moment of pause. I too will pause and kind of let my soul connect to that experience that they shared, and remember too the power of that event. So join with me in a moment of silence, will you? What might it mean for us to reach back to those moments in our collective history and experience that might provide us some wisdom for the journey ahead? To hold them in such a deep and meaningful way that they find place on the landscape of our individual and collective soul. May the experience of those who suffered such great loss at the bombing of Hiroshima, and for all those moments throughout our history, may they find place in our souls so that we might become a wiser, more loving, more compassionate people moving forward. Yeah, amen to that. Amen to that. My guess is that you've had experiences like that where you sit for a moment in the shade and pause and experience the weight of something that we collectively hold. That is so close to what we might think of as the religious experience. Think about what that might have been for you. Maybe you could post up a connecting place to where you experienced that. For me, I remember going through the Holocaust Museum and the power of that journey through that experience of all of the stories. And as I recall, I picked up a card, and so I became a person who was involved in the Holocaust. And I too journeyed through, and at the end, I found out, what happened to me in that experience. That construct of tethering my life in that moment to that experience, right, is the kind of function of religious practices and the ways in which we memorialize that which happened in the past, wisdom from the past, experiences from the past. We carry them with us collectively so that we can move forward. That matters. That sort of thing matters. It's so important. The same thing happened. Probably the other significant one, and these are horrific events, was the 9/11 memorial, and standing at the edge of this chasm with eternal water flowing into the into nothingness. The power of that experience at that memorial just brings home the absolute loss and tragedy that was 9/11. And all the kind of buzz of political and and criticism I had of that whole handling of all that just dissipated in the power of that moment to remember, the depth of pain that caused for our country, for human life, for our common life. That's the power of what that kind of thing can do, right? That matters. I even think, and then I'll get on with it, right? I even think the play Hamilton was an example of this. Think about the people who flooded to see Hamilton, that captures the spirit of the early story of this country in a beautiful way, and you put yourself in that place for a time in order to be affected by it, to imagine how to understand our shared story, to move forward. That stuff matters. So that's what I'm encouraging to think about today is how to not lose connection to that in this time when we're all kind of in our own little lifeboats. And if it means for you to construct a small temple or a small altar area or a corner of your house or an experience that can bring that or keep that capacity alive in your own private life or personal life or family life, household life, that's just so important to continue to nurture, particularly during this time. So I want to encourage you to think about that. I was struck by a little Zen story that reminded me how important this was. And I wanted to share that Zen story today as kind of a centering piece as well today. This was a Zen story by Chung Tzu, and it was interpreted by Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic priest who understood the power of sort of the Zen perspective as it helped him think about his place in the Christian story. And so Thomas Merton was very active in the Zen Christian dialogue for quite some time. And so he did some interpretations of the writings. And this is a story about a person. It says man, but let's just say it's person, right? So a person who was disturbed, right? He was disturbed by the sight of his own shadow, which is sort of a metaphor, right? I'm disturbed by the sight of my own shadow. And he was disturbed by his own footsteps, the way in which he or she was pacing their way through life. So that's how the story begins. And then hear how the story unfolds. There was one who was so disturbed by the sight of their shadow and so displeased by their own footsteps that they determined to get rid of them both. The method they hit upon was to run away from them. So they got up and they began to run. But every time they put their foot down, there was another step. And while the shadow just kept up with them with the slightest of difficulty. So the person attributed their failure to the fact that they were not running fast enough. And so they ran faster and faster and faster without ever stopping until finally they dropped dead. I guess that person failed to realize that if they had merely stepped into the shade for but a moment, the shadow would vanish. And if they sat down and just stayed still for a moment, there would be no more footsteps. Isn't that a great poem? It's an invitation to remember that this idea of dealing with all of life's complexities doesn't always require that you run faster or push harder. Sometimes it requires that you sit calmly in the shade, that you find yourself in a still place. And when you do that, then you begin to gain some perspective that allows you to move forward. In a time when we're all feeling like we're going to have to race back into the fall, those words are beautiful words for all of us. So how might we do some of that? particularly when we find ourselves all stuck at home or coping with life in all of its complexity out from the kind of the privacy of our own bubbles. I would propose kind of a hybrid approach, and that's what I posted on the intro today. One of the things I think we need to reclaim is reaching way back to the way in which religion worked for our ancestors of old, and also continuing to hold on to kind of a more modern approach. And the two constructs I would invite you to think about, one is sort of going back to indigenous models of spirituality, and then also holding to something like, in the Christian tradition, the ritual of communion, which is a very forward-thinking way of helping us frame how we move forward as a people. And if we could bring kind of those two things together more fully, I think it's going to add some depth to our capacity to be religious in our time. Think for a moment of what early religious rituals were really about, right? If you think about ancient humankind, it was how to position yourself in relationship to place, into the natural place that held you, right? The ritualization of that which your ancestors learned from how they related to the land or the animals on the land or the environment and the patterns in the environment, so that you could survive as well. Those were ritualized, memorialized, held in the heart of community so that you could sustain life on the same land as your ancestors. It was it was always looking back to the patterns of behavior that allowed you to sustain yourself on the land, ritualizing those so that you always knew how to stay connected to the very landscape, the animals, the plants, the experience of life that you were embedded within. And in some ways, I think we've kind of lost touch with that. We've forgotten that even our religious story, right, starts off with us in the garden. I mean, we are garden dwellers. We belong within the garden, this capacity to connect to the wisdom of those who lived deeply connected to the land which held them, rather than to the technologies that support them like we do today. We're just so much a part of how we understand our place in world. And I think in many ways we've kind of we've sort of dismissed that as kind of pagan or Wiccan or indigenous cultures that we've moved beyond. I don't think we should do that. So one of the things I would encourage you to think of if you're going to put on vintage wear is, how do you also find a way to ritualize the connection that you have to the very planet that sustains us, or even to the local land that holds you, to the oak tree or the bird song or the animal life that's appearing, and being more present for us in these times. How do you do that so you don't lose the tether to the most spiritual bond we all have with Earth itself? That's something to explore and to play with in your life raft, in your bubble, in your current bubble. That's a beautiful one to hang on to. So that's the vintage work that I think we owe it to our own trajectory to reimagine, to reframe, to revision, to repurpose for our moving forward. Okay, so that's in the hybrid model. That's one thing. So don't just reach back to like religious traditions back in the 60s or the 50s, like we do in church. I want you to go way back, right, to land dwelling rituals. See if you can bring some of that into your life during this time and see what it feels like. So that's the kind of the reaching back piece of this. The reaching forward, you could connect maybe with the experience of something more modern, like the ritualization of a meal that in the Christian tradition, Jesus kind of institutionalizes in Mark's gospel, the earlier gospel. He says, look, he's sitting down, he's having a meal with his friends. They're literally breaking bread and drinking wine like you do. And then Jesus takes that simple experience of a table that's open to his friends, and he realizes there in the sharing of this meal that this moment captures the kind of the collective vision of who the community can be. What would it be like if we could build a community where everyone has a place at the table? What would it be like if we could build a community where we could equitably share the gifts of life, the bread of life with all? What would it be like as a community where we all found that we're all in the same boat? We hold one cup in common, our destiny linked to the destiny of others. For Jesus, that little moment becomes sort of this kind of awakening, sacred moment that then gets ritualized, memorialized. And for many Christians, every week they engage in that kind of practice to connect themselves to a vision of a future, of a way to move forward. That's the hybrid model I'm going to ask you to play with as you think about this. This capacity to reach back to the most ancient ways in which we ritualize relationship to earth and planet, and it's not our connection. We belong in that ecosphere, right? So make sure that's sacred to us, that link, and then ways in which we construct visions for the future that we also ritualize, right? They're not, even though they're kind of linked to our Christian past, they're really an invitation to ritualize hope and forward thinking of how we move forward. That's why religion matters, or at least it's one of the reasons why religion matters, right? This invitation to craft and experience and share ritual and memorial in a way that allow us collectively to gain some wisdom for the future. You can practice that at home. We're going to try to introduce you back into some capacity to be able to do communion at home soon. We're still working on that, but you can work on that project yourself as well. So how to do that? Let me give you a couple of, I don't know. You don't have to take these suggestions, but these are suggestions. If you're a household, one of the ways you could do that is whether you do this weekly or daily, particularly as you get ready to go to school, just gathering as a little family, as a household, and just holding hands in a circle for a moment of silence. But maybe do it in a place that holds pictures of your relatives and your loved ones, and sort of that space in your house that links you to your own family's history. And just be mindful and thoughtful of your connection with so many lives that we're not actively able to nurture in this context right now. To let your kids feel the weight of being family. And then maybe a piece of that kind of invites them, maybe one frame that doesn't have a picture in it, that invites them to remember what it's like to invite others into that feeling of family. That would be an awesome way to ritualize or memorialize the connection to ancestors in your household, and a hopeful future for how you invite your own children to think about the invitation of being open to others. And just to have that moment together once a week before Sunday dinner or whatever your gathering time is, or before you send them off to school at the beginning of the year. I don't know, just something like that. That's an example of trying to honor the capacity for these kind of religious practices in your daily life. Of course, the shrine idea is a great one. The one we proposed a couple of weeks ago, putting an arch around your doorway with some of the kind of accumulated wisdom you're gaining, so you're connected to that before you enter into the world. That's another great one to do. A nature one, I would suggest, if you have like an old oak tree or some kind of thing in nature out in your landscape that you feel like tethers you to the earth in a meaningful way, just pause for a moment and be with that tree or that space, that tomato plant, whatever it happens to be, right? Kind of have a connecting place to earth that you would just visit on a weekly basis and remind yourself that you're bound to earth in a beautiful way. Each of these each of these and whatever you create, and maybe you can share what you create, is really part of the religious capacity of what it means to be human. And today, as we reflect on the powerful ones, like the honoring of what happened in Hiroshima or 9/11, or other major events in our collective life that we hold and sit with for a time, the power of those can be integrated into our daily life as a pathway to greater religious awareness. So that's a lot to bite off of. But let me close with another little Zen piece of poetry today, that ultimately it's not the ritual itself that we want to hold on to, but it's the ritual itself that invites us into something more grand, more deep, more insightful. It's like the rituals are the doorways for the poetry of the soul, if you will. They're the things that kind of allow you time and energy to explore your own soul's journey and your collective soul's journey. And so one final little reading as well from Thomas Merton's work. This is another little piece of poetry from Chuang Tzu, who was a Taoist poet. Did I say Taoist? Sorry, Zen poet. The purpose of the fish trap is to catch fish. And when the fish are caught, the trap is often forgotten. The purpose of the rabbit snare is to catch rabbits, but when the rabbits are caught, the snare is forgotten. The purpose of words is to convey ideas, but when the ideas are grasped, the words are forgotten. Where can I find someone who's forgotten the words? That's the one I would like to talk to. You get the beauty of Zen poetry is you got to go revisit it. You're going to have to go play that back and listen to it a couple times before it starts to sink in, right? I want to go talk to somebody who's forgotten all the words. Can you be a person who dives into the experience of religion to the point where the words are forgotten? Because you have capacity now to live into the wisdom of that experience in some new and wonderful way. That's the invitation. That's why it matters to be religious for our time, particularly in a time that's so confusing like the one we're in now. Okay? All right. That's it for my reflections for the week. Always fun to be thinking that we will talk together on a Sunday morning and maybe what we should talk about. So thanks for the opportunity to chill out with you for a bit. And my hope is that, just do some work, play around with it, have some fun with it, but take it seriously, so you can feel the energy of ritualizing some connection to planet, to future in a meaningful way. A couple announcements. Of course, Martin's music today kind of ties in with this theme. He takes this old German tune and then he brings a creative composer and bloop, blends them together, his own musical vintage wear. So make sure you link to that and listen to that music today. Bible study format. We're having a great time in the Bible study on the Gospel of Mark, but I'm struggling to figure out how to capture it and share it with those who can't be present live. So currently we're just doing it live because that seems to be the most organic way to do it. But we are working with a technical person to figure out a way to launch a kind of a podcast series where you could just listen to it on your phone, both the presentation and then the kind of the Q&A that happens around the presentation. So I know that one's a bit wonkish right now. My apologies, just figuring out the right format to do Bible studies or at least studies together that work well. Also a reminder to hold on to all the people who are my wife's in education. I know that education is just this huge hurdle that we're all having to kind of figure out how to leap over and begin. And it all happens this week. Springstone School is on our site this week. They're starting up, trying to figure out how to do distance learning and then maybe a hybrid model down the road. Just the strain on both the educators and particularly the students who I feel are like, what's happened to my school? And it just breaks your heart that that's going to be such a challenge this fall in particular. So, hug kids, smile at kids, do whatever you can to make sure that we, honor those who are really going to go through this tough transition, and then help them find ways to navigate this, I think is important. And let's see, any other comments I have? No, I don't think so. A quick one on wayfinding. When you do finally come back to church, we're very active in trying to open up the site both as our sacred place of worship, so honoring our sanctuary and the OSLC community, but also creating a community hub called Creekside Commons. And so that'll affect the way in which we name a lot of our rooms through the wayfinding process so that they're more accessible to people in the public. So it's a project we're working on. I'll post some more information about that coming up in this week if you get that as well. Okay, with that, thanks for being together on a Sunday morning. It's going to be a beautiful, warm day. Get out there and experience the outdoors. That seems like the only place where we can kind of be engaged in public behavior in relationship to planet. So take some time to be outdoors today. Be safe. We all have to, I know we're getting tired of this, but we all have to be diligent in the way in which we navigate this virus so that we can soften it enough so it becomes manageable and we can engage back in education and, our common life. It's going to take some time. We're going to get there. It's going to take some time. So, hang in there, find ways to continue to be spiritual along the way. All right. Blessings. Have a great week.